Something shifted along NATO's eastern edge, and most people have no idea how serious it actually got. This was not a drill. This was not a warning shot. This was a direct test of the most powerful military alliance in human history. Before we go any further, ask yourself this. If you had to guess how NATO would actually respond when Russia crosses a line, would you bet on strength, hesitation, or something far more calculated than either? Keep that question in your mind, because the answer is going to change how you see everything that follows. Let's talk about what actually happened. Along the borders of NATO's eastern flank, the countries that sit right on the edge between the Western world and Russia, something happened that analysts have been quietly calling one of the most dangerous provocation sequences since the Cold War. Russian military assets moved, signals were intercepted, airspace was violated, ground units repositioned in ways that were not accidental. When professional military analysts say a move is not accidental, that is not a small thing. That means someone, somewhere, made a deliberate decision. And that decision was aimed directly at finding out how NATO would respond. Here is the thing most people miss. Russia has been doing this for years. Small tests, quiet violations, probing the edges, seeing what happens, watching who blinks. But what happened along the eastern border recently was different in scale, in timing, and in what it seemed to be looking for. This was not a patrol flying slightly off course. This was a coordinated pattern designed to generate a specific reaction. And NATO had to decide, very fast, what that reaction would be. To understand why that decision matters so much, you have to understand what NATO actually is. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is not just an alliance. It is a promise. Specifically, it is a promise built on one sentence in one article, Article 5, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on all members. That sentence is the backbone of European security. It is the reason dozens of countries sleep a little easier at night. And it is also the reason Russia has spent decades probing exactly where the line is between what triggers that promise and what does not. Because here is the brutal truth: if Russia can find actions that are provocative enough to create fear, but not quite clear enough to trigger Article 5, it wins. It creates chaos, division, and psychological pressure without ever firing a shot that the alliance can unanimously agree to respond to. That is the game. That has always been the game. And the eastern border provocation was the latest, most sophisticated round of that game. Now let us get into what NATO actually did. The response came in layers. And that is important to understand because NATO does not work like one country with one army. It works like a coalition of 32 nations, each with their own governments, their own military rules, and their own public pressures. Getting all of them to move in the same direction quickly on something as sensitive as a Russian border provocation, that is genuinely hard. And yet, based on available reports and NATO official communications, the response was faster and more coordinated than many observers expected. Fighter jets scrambled. This happens more often than the public knows, but the scale of the response mattered. Multiple NATO members launched intercept missions. The airspace was monitored, tracked, and defended. No incursion went unacknowledged. Every movement was logged and responded to with a visible presence that said clearly, "We see you, we are here, and we are not confused about what this is." On the ground, NATO rapid reaction forces were placed on higher readiness. That does not mean they were sent to the border with rifles ready. It means the chain of command was activated, logistics were reviewed, and the posture shifted. In military terms, that shift is significant. It tells Russia that the threshold for escalation to a full defensive posture is much lower than it might have hoped. And then came the diplomatic layer. This is where things get interesting. NATO ambassadors met. Statements were issued, but they were careful statements. The language was firm but calibrated. That calibration is not weakness. It is strategy. Because NATO knows, and Russia knows, that the most dangerous thing in a provocation scenario is an overreaction that gives Russia a narrative to exploit. If NATO overreacts publicly, Russia frames it as aggression. If NATO underreacts publicly, Russia frames it as weakness. The only winning move in the public arena is to respond with exactly enough visible strength to make the point, while keeping escalation paths closed. That is what happened, and it is worth pausing to appreciate how difficult that actually is. Think about the political pressure inside these decisions. You have countries like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, countries that share borders with Russia or with Russian-allied Belarus, countries whose governments are looking at this provocation and saying to their people, "We are protected, the alliance is real, Article 5 means something." Those governments need visible reassurance. They need to see NATO aircraft in the sky. They need to feel the weight of the alliance behind them, and at the same time, NATO leadership is managing the risk of giving Russia an excuse to escalate further. Here is where the story gets deeper. Because this provocation did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at a specific moment, a moment when Ukraine is still fighting, when European defense budgets are being debated, when American political attention has been pulled in multiple directions, and when Russia has been watching closely to see if the cracks in NATO unity are real or just noise. Timing in geopolitics is never accidental. When a military power like Russia chooses to test a border, it chooses the moment carefully. It is looking for windows, moments when the alliance might be distracted, divided, or uncertain, and right now there are genuine questions being asked inside European capitals about the future shape of NATO, about who pays for what, about how much the United States will actually commit to European defense in the years ahead. Russia reads those debates. Russia watches those conversations. And a well-timed provocation serves multiple purposes at once. It tests the immediate military response. It tests the political unity of the alliance. And it sends a message to nervous European governments. The Americans might not always be here, but we will. That is not a theory. That is a documented feature of Russian strategic doctrine. The goal is not always to win a battle. The goal is often to create uncertainty, to make countries question the value of their alliances, to plant doubt. And that makes the NATO response, including its speed, its coordination, and its careful public messaging, even more significant. Because a unified, visible, measured response does not just defend airspace or monitor troop movements, it actively fights back against the psychological operation that is running underneath the physical provocation. Here is something that does not get enough attention. The countries on NATO's eastern flank have been preparing for this moment for years. Since 2014, when Russia moved into Crimea, the eastern NATO members began pushing hard for a larger, more permanent Allied presence on their soil, and slowly that presence has been built. Enhanced forward presence battlegroups, multinational units stationed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are now part of the Eastern defense architecture. They are not large enough to stop a full Russian invasion on their own, but they are not meant to be. They are meant to be a tripwire, a visible, undeniable statement that any attack on those countries means attacking soldiers from Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and others, making the decision to escalate infinitely more complicated for Moscow. When the border provocation happened, those battle groups were already there, already training, already integrated into the local defense plans. That matters because it means the physical presence of the alliance was already visible before the crisis spike. Russia could see it. Russia had to calculate it. And that calculation shapes what kind of provocation Russia is willing to attempt. Still with me? Good. Because this is where the story gets into territory that most coverage skips entirely. The provocation was not just about military capability. It was about will. And will is the most important variable in deterrence theory. It does not matter how many tanks or planes you have if the adversary believes you will not use them. Deterrence collapses the moment the other side stops believing in your commitment. Russia has been testing that will systematically, not just in the last few months, over years. Each test is designed to find the point where the alliance flinches, delays, divides, or hesitates in a way that is visible. And here is what makes this moment especially important. According to analysts who track this closely, the Russian assessments of NATO will have shifted somewhat in recent years, not because NATO became more aggressive, but because the alliance's response to the Ukraine conflict demonstrated a level of political and logistical unity that many, including some inside Russia, did not expect. Sanctions were coordinated, weapons were delivered. Intelligence was shared at a level that would have been hard to imagine before February 2022. And that unity sent a signal, not just to Ukraine, to every NATO member on the eastern flank, and critically to Moscow. But signals have to be refreshed. They erode over time if they are not reinforced. And that is exactly what border provocations are designed to do, to see if the signal is still strong, to test whether the unity that appeared in one moment holds in the next moment under different circumstances with different political pressures. The NATO response to this provocation was, in that sense, about more than the immediate incident. It was about maintaining the credibility of deterrence itself. Because deterrence is not a one-time achievement. It is something you have to keep proving over and over, under pressure, in real time. Every time NATO responds with speed, coordination, and calm resolve, it makes the next provocation marginally less likely to cross into something more serious. Every time it hesitates, divides, or appears confused, it makes the next test harder to pass. And that raises a question worth sitting with: how long can this hold? Because there are real stresses inside the NATO alliance, real debates about burden sharing, real political shifts in some member countries that have introduced uncertainty about long-term commitment, real questions about whether the appetite for sustained engagement in European security will remain strong across different governments and different election cycles. Russia is patient. That is one of the most important things to understand about how Moscow thinks. Russian strategic culture has always had a deep willingness to operate on long time frames, to absorb short-term setbacks while waiting for long-term conditions to improve. And from Russia's perspective, the current pressure on NATO unity is not something to be ignored. It is something to be cultivated, to be waited out, to be accelerated where possible. That is the context in which this border provocation must be understood. It is not just a military event. It is a chapter in a much longer story. A story about whether a large, wealthy, nuclear-armed power that feels its influence shrinking can find ways to reassert dominance over the space it considers its strategic inheritance, without triggering the full force of an alliance it knows it cannot defeat in open conflict. That is the tightrope Russia walks, and that is the tightrope NATO has to keep navigating every time the alarm sounds along the eastern edge. Now, where does this go from here? Based on what is known, NATO is not planning to de-escalate its eastern posture. If anything, the direction of travel is toward more presence, not less. Several NATO members have made public commitments to increase defense spending. The 2% GDP target for defense, which was for years more of a political talking point than a reality, is now being taken more seriously by more governments than at any previous moment in the alliance's history. Germany, which spent decades deliberately limiting its military profile for historical reasons, has begun a significant rearmament effort. Poland is building one of the most capable ground forces in Europe. These are not small shifts. They represent a structural change in how European NATO members think about their own security. And that structural change is, in part, a response to exactly the kind of provocation we are talking about. Each test, each violation, each close call along the eastern border has served, perhaps unintentionally from Russia's perspective, to harden European resolve rather than soften it. But hardening resolve and actual military readiness are two different things. The resolve is clearly stronger. The readiness is improving, but it takes time. Defense industrial capacity, the ability to actually produce the equipment, ammunition, and systems that modern warfare requires, was allowed to atrophy across most of Europe during the long post-Cold War peace. Rebuilding that capacity is a years-long process, maybe a decade-long process, and in that gap between resolve and full readiness, there is risk. That is the window that a patient adversary watches for. This is also the moment to think about what kind of miscalculation looks like in this environment. Wars do not always start because one side decides it wants war. They sometimes start because one side makes a move it believes is controllable, and the other side responds in a way that was not anticipated, and suddenly the situation is moving faster than either side's ability to manage it. That is how escalation spirals happen. Not from clear, deliberate decisions, but from a chain of reactions where each step seemed rational to the side taking it, and yet the chain leads somewhere no one intended. NATO is aware of this risk, managing escalation, maintaining communication channels with Moscow even during periods of severe tension, keeping clear thresholds visible. This is the unglamorous, difficult, essential work of crisis management. It happens in meetings that are never public, in communications that are never reported, in decisions made by people whose names most viewers will never know. And that work is happening right now. Even as the physical situation along the border remains tense, even as the political debates inside the alliance continue, even as Russia watches and waits and probes. What you are watching when you watch NATO respond to a Russian border provocation is not just a military news story. You are watching the management of the most consequential geopolitical rivalry on the planet. You are watching an alliance of democracies, with all the messiness and slowness that democracies bring, trying to stay ahead of a threat that is patient, strategic, and deeply committed to a different vision of how the world should be organized. And you are watching it work, imperfectly, under pressure, with real limitations, but working. That matters, because the alternative, an alliance that fractures under pressure, that hesitates when it should act, that sends mixed signals at critical moments, that alternative leads somewhere much darker and much more dangerous. The eastern border is not just a line on a map. It is the line between a world where the rules still hold, where borders mean something, where sovereignty is real, and a world where the strongest power simply takes what it wants and everyone else adjusts. Every time NATO scrambles a jet, coordinates a response, and holds its line with calm precision, it is defending that border, not just physically, but as an idea, as a principle, as a demonstration to every country watching, from the Baltic coast to Southeast Asia, that alliances matter, that commitments survive pressure, and that the world has not yet given up on the rules it built after the last great catastrophe. That is what is at stake. Every single time that alarm sounds along the eastern edge. Now let me ask you something directly. You just spent this time understanding something that most people will never take the time to understand. You know the layers now. The military response, the political stakes, the psychological operation running underneath, the long game Russia is playing, and what NATO is actually doing to counter it. So what do you think? Is NATO's approach the right one? Or is there a smarter move on the board that the alliance is missing? Drop your real answer in the comments, not the safe answer, the one you actually believe. The best responses always come from the people who are paying close attention, and right now, that is you.